This episode is sponsored by Mia Water. Mia was founded by Robert Goulet, who I interviewed on this podcast, and I really see Robert as one of the pioneers in the field of water and human health. Water, as we all know, is one of the foundational pillars of life, and yet most of what we drink is full of chemicals, it's stagnant, and it's been stripped of its life-giving energy. Robert created a device which actually structures water and gives it a negative charge, which is truly amazing and vital for human health and the health of the planet. All of that can be measured and tested. These devices are small, they're really well built, and they last a lifetime. They are an investment, but in my opinion, I think one of the most worthwhile investments you can make for your own health and the health of your family. I've been fascinated by water for many years. I followed the work of some of the luminaries in the field, like Gerald Pollack and Viktor Schauberger, and I think Robert has really advanced this field a huge step with the invention of these devices and making this life-giving energy, life-giving water energy, more accessible to all. I use Mia Water devices in my own home, so I'm really happy to recommend them and to have them as a sponsor of this podcast. As listeners of the show, receive 10% off all of their products at miawater.com/universe. That's meawater.com/universe, and use the coupon code universe at checkout. On this episode of the podcast, I sat down with White Walking Feather, also known as Rob in the Pagé family. White Walking Feather Rob is a really, really fascinating guy. It was really an honor, a pleasure to sit down with him, have him share his story. He's had a fascinating life. It's maybe a bit of a different topic or genre than many of the episodes on this podcast. But I think Rob is a truly spiritual man in the true meaning of that word, and even a shaman in his own right. We spoke about his background, kind of how drugs and depression led him to a point in his life where he was very close to death, and how that was, I think, very much an awakening experience to him. And really, he began to explore these ideas of sovereignty, of freedom, and what that really means, and how he saw in the Western world that we've really been removed from tribe, from community, and giving away our power and responsibility to the state and to the power of man, and how in essence we're spiritual beings, and how he completely removed himself, as he says, emancipated himself from these slave states. So getting rid of his driver's license, passport, not paying taxes, completely weaning himself off the dependency of the state. That may sound like a strange thing, but I think as you listen to him speak, it's a very, very fascinating subject, and really, I think, at the heart of all of these practices, which is to completely be free, to completely be responsible for oneself, to work voluntarily in community, in tribe, through a deep process of self-inquiry, and what that means to be in direct relationship with spirit, and to completely give our lives over to spirit. Again, fascinating individual. I think we went almost 3 hours, which for me is always the sign of a great podcast. And I think we easily could go for another 3, 6, 10 hours. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. As always, if you're able to support this podcast, that's a really big help to me. Patreon is a really good website. You can sign up for as little as $1 a month. I really like that website because it's built off this idea of reciprocity. So if you feel like you're gaining something from this podcast, it's an amazing way to give back. And also there's a lot of bonus materials, early access to shows, Q&As. There's a really nice community there. So if you're able to do that, thank you so much in advance. And as always, thank you so much to the people supporting that way. And if not, as always, just helping with the algorithm. So if you're viewing this on YouTube or Rumble, hitting the like button, turning on the notification bell, subscribing to the show. And if you're listening to this on Apple Podcast or Spotify, leaving a starred rating and a short review. And then finally, if you're interested in working with myself, you can find out more about me on my website, nicotianarustica.org. There'll be a link to that in the show notes. Working with me one-on-one, integration work, consultation work, and my main work, which is working directly with plants with my friend and colleague, Marav Artsy. We have a number of retreats coming up. up, and you can find all of that information on our website. So that's it for the intro. And without further ado, here is my conversation with White Walking Feather.
Running out from the maze, running out of the maze today. Running out from the maze, running out from the maze, running out from the maze today. I'm running out from the maze, running out from the maze, run out of the maze today.
How do you prefer to be called? White Walking Feather?
Most people in the world know me as Rob, but my spirit name is White Walking Feather. I walk in spiritual jurisdiction, so when I speak of my work, I prefer the name White Walking Feather, but feel free to call me Rob too, so that people can connect. And my family name is pronounced Pagé. It's French, so it's Rob in the Pagé family. That was that's the name of my vessel. And
I mean, I think that could actually be a really interesting place to start, because the name holds a lot of power. And I think a big part of your work is actually tracing a lot of these things back. And it's interesting because even in a lot of the practices that I do and I work with, the people we're working with, we have them say their name, because there's a great power to that. There's a calling of something deeper. You know, and this will probably open up a huge field, so feel free to go as deep or as little as you want to. But as you said, your spirit name is White Walking Feather, which I think is very fascinating, because often in kind of the more, for lack of better words, the Western cultures we come from, we all have a given name, which in my case is Jason, and in your case is Rob. And then usually we have a family name, and traditionally those family names actually would have been something like son of your father or grandson of someone, or maybe at some point your profession, although that even started to get to kind of this maybe feudal system of kingship that I'm sure we'll give into. And even from my understanding, a lot of that was based on taxes, so you could differentiate who someone was. This was not Rob, son of someone. This was Rob the blacksmith, or so Rob Smith, and that kind of took you from a larger picture to something very specific, something that could be reduced or isolated and then controlled. But it's very interesting, because when I was in the Amazon, I lived a long time with a group of people called the Shipibo people, and it's very interesting because they often wouldn't name their child until their child was about 7 years old, because they said that the spirit of the child hadn't fully formed yet, and they wanted to see who this child was before they gave him a name, because the name was very sacred. And so the name usually represented something of the earthly realm, but connected to spirit, and then you were given a name. This is kind of a long way of just asking. Maybe the first question is, what does the name mean to you? You know, even how you say it is very, I think, particular. Rob of the Pagé family, and you know, I would imagine the answer begin to bring delineation to these systems that do begin to name and ultimately control us.
yeah, actually, it's Rob in the Pagé family. It's not of, because of is apart from. I want to rejoin the family. So my vessel is in that family. It's not apart from it. And you know, I've studied the legal system for 20 years and realized that studying the English language was more important, because it was the language that got distorted and hijacked by the legal system. And so I don't actually study the legal system anymore. I just study the language of my ancestors, English being one of them. My ancestors came from Europe, areas of France, Germany, England, and they were colonized 1,000 years ago or more. So to reconnect to my ancestry to explore restoring the white tribe to proper standing required that I study my language and be able to stand in that. And so through my legal training or studying, I realized that, some of these, the name had huge weight to it. And within the legal system, there's a first name and a last name. Well, the first name and last name is part of the corporate person, but I'm not that person. And I actually sent that person back to the king back in 2008, 2009, when I declared my sovereignty. And instead had my vessel return back to the power and authority of my family, my ancestors. And then about 10 years ago, I was invited to ceremony by some friends, brothers in Treaty 6 territory in central Alberta. And in that ceremony, the Red Tribe gave me a spirit name, White Walking Feather, and I actually received a white eagle feather in that same ceremony as an acknowledgement of my work, of the process of decolonizing and returning to being a steward of the land. And they acknowledged me for that, and I've since had conversations with clan mothers in Alberta and in Manitoba, teaching me about how there's a difference between the tribes and the race. The tribes of people, whether they're red or white or black or yellow, it doesn't matter. We're here to steward the earth and protect Mother Earth, and because we are the earth, we are the land, we are a part of that land, and it's up to us to steward and protect it. Where the race of people, they're the colonizers, they're the ones that want to rape and pillage, and there's a separation there, and the name I found was part of that separation, that part to remove us from being or seeing ourselves as part of the land, and instead seeing us as separate from and having the capacity to own the land and control it and manipulate it and pillage it. And the corporate name was, the first name and last name was part of that process to hoodwink us, to separate us. And so this journey of emancipating myself from that colonial mindset and return back to spiritual jurisdiction, this spiritual standing that I explore, part of that was acknowledging the name that they use. It's not me. It's not who I am. I am a spiritual being having this physical experience. This vessel was granted to me by Creator through Divine Feminine to have this experience here on Mother Earth. And that came through the biological family of my vessel, but also an acknowledgement of my spirit and the spiritual jurisdiction that's required for me to stand because the kingdom is within me. And so a spirit name is extremely important to me, to not only acknowledge that, but to ground myself in that self-truth that I've explored and discovered over the last 20 years.
This is also going to be a kind of a big question, but how would you describe now your life's work? I mean, there may be some of the audience who's familiar with you, but I would imagine many are not. What would you describe as is your life's work? Because it's something so fascinating and so rare that I think anyone does, or people even consider that. Again, as I was mentioning maybe before we recorded, I use this word cosmovision a lot, worldview. And someone very beautifully said this to me one time, which is that we can't separate our worldview from our conscious. That essentially how we see the world shapes our reality, and I think so much of what you're doing is actually beginning to trace that back to something deeper, to more fundamental of this question of know thyself. Who am I? Who am I? Because we take so many things for granted, and it's part of the beauty and maybe the shortcomings of in our Western society. We're very good at naming, of reducing, of refining, of alchemizing, but then we tend to lose the bigger picture, and we can get lost in all of that. How would you describe what it is that and of course you're still in a process, like everyone, but what have you begun to do in this act of sovereignty, of kind of decoupling yourself from this state, from these control mechanisms that we're all subject to, whether we consciously realize it or not?
Well, that's a huge question, and I could talk for days on it. But just to be clear, what it's not like, I'm not here to be a rebel or disobedient or any of that kind of stuff. My life purpose is to teach people how to navigate healthy relationship. And that came about as a result of my struggles for the first 30, 35 years of my life with addictions and depression and suicidal ideation, suicidal attempts, abuse, trauma, and it nearly destroyed me. And in 2001, I hit a reflection point where I realized I have to change or I'm going to die. Literally, I was at that rock bottom place. And that allowed me to then let go of a lot of those preconceived notions that I had on how to live, and really start to learn how to love myself, how to set boundaries, how to communicate, how to connect to my feelings, how to verbalize my feelings, and navigate relationship without passive aggressive behaviors or manipulations or any of that kind of stuff. And it's been a 25-year journey of exploring that, and it was actually that process that started me on this exploration of sovereignty and removing dependencies, because I realized that my relationship with the state and the corporations, all these fictional constructs, were also abusive relationship. And so as an expression of self-love and me learning how to respect myself, I realized I can't in all good conscience participate in those relationships, because they violate everything I've learned about what it means to love myself and to be responsible and accountable for myself. And so that then sent me through this journey over the last 2 decades of exploring what that means. And so that required that I really be honest with myself and acknowledging the areas where I'm dependent on others, and explore how to remove those dependencies and build that level of independence where I can stand on my own and explore what it is to have a healthy relationship with Mother Earth, because she provides for my food and clothing and shelter and all that sort of thing, not the corporations. And and now I'm at a point now where I realize that that hyper independence that I swung into is also a trauma response. And so now I'm trying to find that middle balance and realize that I need tribe. I need people in my life where we can explore these ideas together and help each other meet our needs without falling back into codependency, or without the use of coercion or violence or that sort of thing. And so my life purpose is kind of going through a metamorphosis and a realization that what I'm looking to restore now is how my ancestors actually lived, thousands of years ago. And I'm not suggesting that we go start living in caves again and that sort of thing. We have knowledge, we have technology, we have tools that we can use to help. But it's a removal of those old paradigms and exploring the question, how do I do this while maintaining my sovereignty and honoring myself, my own boundaries, and standing in the kingdom that's within me, and seeing the other people in my tribe in the same sacred light, and helping to build relationships where we can honor each other's sovereignty. If somebody's sick or they fall down, that sort of thing, our job is to restore them back to their sovereignty as quickly as possible, not to build a codependency or any of that kind of stuff. And these are foreign concepts that I've never been taught before in my life. And I'm pushing 60 now, and but I know that just by asking the question, Spirit will bring the knowledge and the wisdom we need to be able to do that. And so, yeah, my life purpose is to it's all about relationship. My book is all about relationship. My work is all about relationship, and how do I navigate relationship with peace and love and compassion and empathy, and with conscious awareness, like the level of consciousness that Christ was suggesting that we explore. That's what I'm looking to explore and practice it. And so I hold Sacred Heart circles every week, online. I have people sometimes all over the world joining me to explore these questions and explore how we can heal and navigate the feelings that we're going through, and navigate these ideas, because a lot of them are false and rooted in anger or shame or guilt, or all of these kind of uncomfortable feelings. And how do we reconcile that? How do we heal that so that we can honor ourselves and honor each other, and still have our needs met? But that also required that I change how I define success in life. For me, wealth isn't defined on how big my house is, or how fat my bank account is, or the toys sitting in the driveway. Wealth for me, I realize that I can't take any of that stuff with me, but what I can take when I pass from this realm is my knowledge, my wisdom, my experiences, my memories. And so for me, I collect that instead. And so I've let go of this desire to acquire things, and instead put myself in a position where I can acquire relationships, where I can build these memories and experiences. And as a result, I've also had to redefine love. In the past, in my relationships, my sacred partnerships, I was manipulated through the colonial system to think that love equaled sex. And so for me, it was all about sexual conquest. But now I've realized that intimacy doesn't equal sex. Intimacy, there's a physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual component to it. And there's different levels and degrees of intimacy depending on the type of relationship I have with people. And this is where the medicine wheel really helps me to find balance and articulate that. And the medicine wheel is a tool that cultures all over the world have been using for thousands of years. And So by acknowledging these different levels of intimacy and different types of intimacy, it really helped me to um, be able to build intimacy, build connection, communicate with people, and build trust as a result of me changing how I approach relationship. And, you know, this is something that I've only figured out about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. And so I'm now practicing that and finding tremendous connection and um, satisfaction and love as a result of, you know, challenging these old paradigms that I was raised with. So that's, you know, the basics of the work that I do. This is my life purpose.
I think this idea of relationships is so fundamental, and I'd love to come back and explore that more. I think before that, you know, one of the really interesting things you've done is, I don't know what the right word would be, maybe decoupling or beginning to remove yourself from um, systems that, whether it's conscious or unconsciously, control us. I think a lot of people don't look at our current times in that way. Maybe more so, maybe also after COVID and everything that happened with that. But you know, even when you speak of like days, or when someone speaks about days of kingships, I think we look at that as some distant past. Or when people speak of dictatorships, we think it's something very foreign, and that there's no remnants of that left. And yet, very few people even question the idea of a state, or that we have an obligation to a state. You know, even I found COVID very interesting, and that you know, this idea, and you've seen it in systems around the world like communism, fascism, but this idea that the highest authority resides in the realm of man, and that's ultimately what we have to pledge obedience to and follow the dictates of, because it's this idea that it's in our best interest, and that we don't have the power to be sovereign, to be able to lead our own lives. You know, even I come from the U.S., and it's always been this very interesting kind of dilemma for me, because I think the U.S., of all the countries I have studied, has this amazing system, even this one line, you know, even this idea that our Constitution, that the Declaration, that it's not so much enshrining our liberties as it is restraining how government can infringe upon those liberties. But even this idea that our rights are inalienable, that they're God-given, I think there's something very revolutionary about that, and something I think we've moved very far away from, because usually in the rhetoric of today, it's more that our rights are given to us and therefore they can be taken from us. It's quite a revolutionary idea that our rights are God-given, and I think very few people really truly understand or think about that, or even believe that essentially by being born, you have an inalienable right to your life, to your existence, to your freedoms. And again, this is going to be a huge question, but can you kind of trace back, I guess to maybe finish my point with that, but even in the US, there still is a government. And so always that seed is still there. And while we have all of these ways to restrict its power and its use and its abuses, we can see how far that's gone astray from potentially the founding of that. And usually the argument is that, well, it's still maybe a necessary evil, that we still need to have a state in the same way that we need to have a king, or we need to have a pope, or there needs to be some higher authority in the realm of man that's able to dictate and move pieces around, to distribute things. can you give, and again, this is a huge question, but can you give a bit of maybe history of how we came to this point that we're in, that we just de facto assume and believe that a hierarchical structure in the realm of man is necessary for our survival?
Yeah. Um, I did a lot of research in this area because for me, I realized that I couldn't fix the relationship if I didn't understand the true nature of that relationship with the king. And so I was gifted a book, I don't know, it was 10, 15 years ago, Treatise on Copyhold. It was written in the early 1800s, and it described the laws of England. Very similar to if you research Blackstone commentaries. Sir William Blackstone wrote those commentaries, those 4 books, back in the late 1700s to explain the laws of England. But what it explains is feudalism. So in 1066, William the Conqueror, the Norman conquest of England, brought feudalism to England, and the king then created the Domesday Book, which is essentially an inventory of all the people in the land, and the roles that keep track of everything in the domain of the king. And that system, whether people agree with it or not, is still in place today. It's just they don't use the feudal terms, but the relationship is still the same. So feudalism essentially means that the land is claimed by the king, and the people are feudal serfs. They call them citizens now, but are feudal serfs to the king. And the people then receive benefits and privileges from the king in exchange for service owed to the king. And those benefits and privileges are things like healthcare and driver's licenses, and even the privilege of possessing land. See, a fee simple title doesn't mean people own the land. It's just a grant from the king to possess the land. The king can still dictate the rules and regulations that the people have to follow in order for the use of that land. That's why people have to get building permits and all that kind of stuff. And the service owed is in the form of property taxes each year. So all the taxes, all the fines, fees, all that kind of stuff that people pay are services owed to the king in exchange for the benefits and the privileges, like driving is a privilege, voting is a privilege. All of these privileges are owed, are received by people, and service is then owed. So in Canada, there's a department of the government that's called Service Canada, and people think that Service Canada is there to serve the people, but Service Canada is there to manage the service owed by the people. And people think that the money in the bank accounts of the king is the taxpayers' money, but that's not true. That money is the king's money, and he can do whatever he wants with it. People think that the government is there to serve the people, and that's not true either. All the oaths that police, bureaucrats, politicians, all that they all swear an oath to the king. None of them swear an oath to the people. The U.S. is a bit different because they had this little thing called the American Revolution and the Constitution and Declaration of Independence, and which meant that the people ended up being sovereign with none to govern but themselves. And you can find many instances in the Supreme Court of America where they say exactly that. But that was usurped through the corporate takeover that happened, and that corporate takeover has now reintroduced feudal principles into the United States. So depending on whether you're a citizen of the United States, uppercase U, proper name, United States of America, or the lowercase u united, meaning the states of America are united, so the united describes the states, that is the republic. And so there's a manipulation that's even happening in the US as well too, and so people aren't consciously aware of the two different jurisdictions. One could be the corporate fiction, all uppercase United States of America, or they could stand in the republic, the lowercase u United States of America, and be sovereign with none to govern but themselves. But the state in the US still has the consent of the governed, and so the people are still consenting to have their government rule over them. But the Constitution, whether it's the United States Constitution or the BNA Act or the Constitution Act of 1982 in Canada, those documents aren't there to protect and acknowledge the people. Those documents are there to build a box for the state to function in, and it's up to the people to acknowledge the box and make sure that they stay in the box. The rights that are acknowledged within those documents are there to remind the government that they're not supposed to usurp the rights that God gave us, that Creator granted to us. We have many other rights. We just set up certain acknowledgments within these constitutional documents to remind the people that swear an oath that your power is limited, you have only a small scope, and if you step outside of that box, you're going to get your hand slapped. But that responsibility to make sure that those bureaucrats and politicians stay in the box is up to the people. And the people have forgotten or abdicated their responsibility, and now we end up with people wanting authority and, in tyrannical terrain in most countries around the world. And they're using feudal principles to do it. People, every time they sign their signature, signature is an attestation. Attestation is an oath. Well, Scripture says we're not even supposed to be swearing oaths. Let my yea be yea, my nay be nay. But every time we swear an oath, we're putting our knee down on the floor and swearing an oath of fealty to some earthly king. And so how do I live without swearing oaths? I had to restore my proper standing and remove myself from these institutions that have grown up around us. And I did that by refusing service. When I refuse service, that also means that I have to turn back all titles. Well, title to land, driver's license is a title, passports, birth certificates, all, social insurance numbers, all of those are titles, tenures granted to me by the king. And in some of those documents, it even says it's the property of the government of Alberta or property of the government of Canada. It's not even my property. So I make no claims against any of that. And I make no claim of ownership either. That's an acknowledgement of the authority of spirit, because the land belongs to Creator. It doesn't belong to the king. And I belong to the land. And any claim of ownership over the land puts me into involuntary slavery. And so this view of how I relate to the land and relate to the king is very, very different than how most other people see it. And it took me years to get my head wrapped around it because I had to deal with this old programming that I was going through, that I went through in my life. And and it's also scary too. Like, I grew up believing that the government was there to protect me. And the reality is that it's not. And I don't know in other areas around the world, but here in Canada, the government is actively killing people through MAID programs and vaccinations, and even actively destroying the economy right now to impoverish people and implement even more draconian, tyrannical programs. But these are all globalist agendas that are taking place, and they're going to use feudalism principles to do it. And I see it. Now that I've studied feudalism, I see how they depend on people to, whether it's consciously done or not, to participate in it of their own free will. They still are going to engage in manipulations and coercion and fear tactics and all that kind of stuff to gain compliance. But in the end, we all still have a choice. Whether we're consciously aware of that choice or not is irrelevant. I just happen to go through a process in my life where I had to start exploring these questions, and that made me realize and be able to see what was actually going on because of my experience with depression and suicide and addictions and all that kind of stuff. So for me, it was very clear that I don't want to participate in it. I acknowledge that I have the right to enslave myself, and I did in the past, and I refuse to exercise that right now. That's how powerful we are. We are extremely powerful spiritual beings, and I believe we're here to learn, well, I'm here to learn how to govern that power. So instead of giving it away to other people and corrupting them, I'm choosing to learn how to keep that power and learn how to govern it. Because if I give it away, I'm doing harm to others, because that power, when it consolidates, corrupts people, and that's a harm. And that's not love. And so for me to love myself and to love my neighbor as myself requires that I learn how to govern that power so that I don't corrupt and I don't do harm to others by making them responsible for me. That's my responsibility. I am 100% responsible and accountable for myself and navigating relationship with others who want to explore the same.
Yeah, beautifully put. What are the what are some of the challenges you hear most? I mean, kind of this idea of like steel manning. What are the common arguments that you hear, you've encountered, or that you still hear as to the necessity of a state or the state in capital letters, and how do you respond to those?
Well, I've always heard, well, who's going to build the roads, or, what do you do if you get sick, that sort of thing. Um, and the third one that I often hear is, what about the people that do rape and pillage, or, murder, that sort of thing. I'm not here to dismantle or destroy the state. I acknowledge that the state is there and is governing people who don't know how to govern themselves. And I'm okay with that. Because I know that there's many people out there that refuse to govern themselves. I believe everyone can govern themselves. I believe everyone has the ability and to do that. But what's lacking is the will to self-govern. So I'm not here to destroy the state or any of that sort of thing. I'll stand up and testify to its violence and abuse and wickedness, but I'm not going to destroy it. But I also know that when we all go through this journey of healing and self-exploration and learning how to navigate relationships and accept responsibility and accountability for ourselves, that our needs will be met, and it won't require a bureaucracy to do it. I know that my idea of restoring our tribes will also restore our capacity to be able to heal one another, to nourish one another, to provide food, clothing, shelter, healthcare, all that sort of thing. That we currently also to look after our young and our elders. There's no sending our kids to school for brainwashing or our elders to nursing homes to die. Um, our tribes will acknowledge that we need all of those individuals together because everyone has value. Everyone has a place within the tribe, a level of contribution to meet needs. Like our elders can be teaching our young can be helping look after the elders. There's lots of that we can do to meet the needs of people through all stages of life. And I know that when we restore ourselves to proper standing, then, making decisions like, roads or that sort of thing becomes very easy to navigate. And I find it would also be way cheaper too if we did it ourselves rather than depending on the bureaucracy to do it. Because the bureaucracy is full of corruption and greed, and these are fundamental human failings that get magnified as the consolidation of power builds up higher and higher through these provincial, national, and even international organizations. So I know there's lots of people that have these kind of arguments, but I invite people to explore the idea. I'm not here to convince people, but just bring an idea and let's explore it, because I don't have all the answers. I'm not even going to pretend I have any of the answers, because I know that the solution isn't based on the world according to Rob or according to White Walking Feather. This is going to require all of us starting a conversation and exploring what the answers are going to be, because everyone has different needs. Different areas of the world have different needs. The ecology is different. The logistics is different. But I have faith that Spirit is going to help orchestrate this so that we can all figure it out. And there'll be cultural differences. There might be economic differences. Like whatever the differences are, we can figure it out without falling back into giving our power away to the earthly kings. 1 Samuel 8 in the Bible is a conversation between King Samuel and God. And King Samuel had the people coming to him wanting him to rule over them, and he didn't want to do that. And so he was talking to God, and God said, don't worry about it. Go ahead and rule over them. It's me they're rejecting, not you. But warn them, to have an earthly king, these are going to be the consequences. And if you read that passage, it's exactly what's going on today. And and the struggle that we have is about giving our power away to earthly kings rather than trusting in Spirit, trusting in God to look after us and govern us and help us navigate the challenges that we face in life. And so that's Yeah, that's what I've seen in in regards to the objections that I've witnessed over the years.
You use this, I think, very powerful word, slavery, and I think most people, when they hear that word, they're immediately repelled by it. We all think we somehow, I think we acknowledge that we're against slavery. Although I always think it's an interesting experiment, because if you were to be in a classroom of people and you would say, well, 100 years ago or 200 years ago, would you have supported slavery? Almost no one would raise their hands, because it's very easy to look at things from our present day consciousness. But the reality is the vast majority of people would have, because that's what people did throughout human history. But it's very difficult for us to see that within ourselves, that we can be slaveholders, we can be ones who enslave, because all humans have done that all throughout the world. And I think also we have this very strong affinity to freedom. I always find it so interesting, like so many of the movies that speak to us, like Braveheart or Star Wars, it's all about kind of fighting the empire, finding freedom, standing up to something. And yet, as you said, and I think this isn't something people often think about, is the nature of the state is very often it's predicated first on coercion, trying to coerce you to do what the state demands. But eventually, built into the mechanism of the state is violence. I mean, that the state has a monopoly on violence. If you don't do what they do, first they'll try and coerce you, and if you don't do that, eventually they will use violence. Men will show up at your door and use physical violence to conform to their desires, and that's slavery. Whether you speak about chattel slavery or indentured servitude, I mean, all of those to some degree, that they had some inkling of slavery. I mean, their lives weren't controlled 24/7. They could, they had little moments of you could do certain things. But I think we think of ourselves as free beings because, again, this worldview that we see ourselves through. Could you speak a bit more to that idea of slavery? Because again, I think that's a very foreign concept to people.
Yeah, there's different forms of slavery, right? So, the slavery, that was happening in 17, 1800s was, actual physical, beating the slaves into obedience. But today there's still slavery, debt slavery to, the banks or the globalists or any kind of lender. If people have debt, then they're enslaved to their creditors. But even being a citizen is a form of slavery because it requires obedience. Not sure most people are aware, but the letters patent that instituted the office of the Governor General of Canada literally says in there that the people are ordered to be obedient to the Governor General to help him in the execution of his duties. And that obedience is enforced by a monopoly on coercion and force, just as you said. So if you're not obedient, then they will come and they will bring you back into obedience, whether that's fines or penalties or arrest or jail. They have mechanisms to bring people back into obedience. The manipulation is that the king says he's responsible for maintaining the peace, but there's two different definitions of peace. One is order, and the other is tranquility. Well, order requires violence in order to maintain order. Tranquility is the type of peace that I'm exploring. Order is the type of peace that the king explores. And when people apply for any kind of benefit or privilege, they're agreeing to the terms and conditions that the king lays out, and obedience is one of them. And that's why the king is starting to militarize the police as well too. So when people protest, protesting is actually a form of disobedience. It's a form of disobedience that is highly effective in most cases, but is still being disobedient. What I'm advocating is not disobedience, but peaceful non-compliance. And there's a difference between the two. Because when I remove myself, emancipate myself from being a feudal serf of the king, I'm no longer a slave or subject of the king. So now I'm no longer being disobedient because I'm not subject to him. But that also requires that I maintain the peace, because the king is actually responsible for war. The king is the head of the military. The king is a military organization, and the economy that the king maintains through his organization is a military economy. When I emancipated myself, I chose to no longer participate in that economy because I didn't want to any of my energy to go towards any of the violence or coercion or death or murder or wars or any of that kind of stuff that's perpetuated by the state. So I stand as a witness to testify that people who, are citizens and, paying their taxes and generating goods and services for this military economy is complicit in the crimes of that economy. And so I found that the only way for me to stand in proper standing was to emancipate myself from all that and no longer be enslaved by it. So as a result, I had to get rid of all the debt. I have no mortgages. I have no lines of credit, no credit cards. I didn't even have a bank account. I don't have any documentation from the state. There's no birth certificates, or driver's license, or any of that kind of stuff. I sent all that back too. So there's no debt. There's no oath of fealty. I don't owe him any service. I haven't bent a knee to anybody. But the consequence of that is, how do I live and survive and thrive? And that required learning what it meant to actually navigate life with true freedom. And it was a monumental learning curve. And I'm still learning. That's one of the reasons why I'm exploring tribe building, is because doing this by myself is a lot of really hard work. And I'm getting tired. Like, I need help. The tribe is there to provide help. I have knowledge and wisdom and experience to contribute to that. But freedom is hard work. It's challenging. It's requires conscious awareness to make sure that I don't accidentally put myself back into a place of being a slave. And yeah, it's challenging because I was so used to being a slave. I had these expectations that, people would look after me. I could just call 911 and somebody would come and rescue me. But living this way, I don't want 911. I don't want some people feeling obligated that they have to come and, restart my heart if I drop of a heart attack or anything like that. That required me to then really explore my relationship with death. and life, um, and so I've really explored my relationship with death. And, I explored it, when I was going through my suicide attempts and that sort of thing. But I know deep in my heart, because of the work that I've done to reconnect with Creator and my spirit, is that, yeah, my body can get sick and die, but, the true essence of who I am, this spiritual being that I am, I'm immortal. I'll pass on and move on to other opportunities. Um, and so I trust that spirit will guide my life, and that I will die in my own time when when I get called back home. But until then, I'm protected, um, and I'm not afraid to die. So I'm not going to enslave myself to put these infrastructures together to extend life or to prevent death or any of that sort of thing. This required me to really explore this healthy relationship with death. And that also helped me to work through the fears and the anxiety of walking away from these safety nets that enslaved me and compelled me to support them, and instead find a different way of navigating life where I don't end up enslaving myself, um, and really explore what it really means to be free. And it's not easy. Freedom is not easy.
It's interesting because I think in a lot of shamanic traditions across the world, they would say that the path of the shaman is a path of death, and really beginning to familiarize yourself with death, ultimately so that we can be free. One of the interesting things I heard you speak about was these three realms, which I think ties into that, because very often archetypally and again loosely worded shamanic practices, they speak of three realms: the spirit realm, the lived realm, the underworld. And I also heard you interestingly speak about this idea of fiction, the illusion, and that's often a concept that you hear in spiritual traditions all over the world, from Vedanta in India, that it's this difference between Maya and maybe loosely what could be called Sat, truth, and that the truth or beauty or that life-giving energy is the opposite of Maya, which is the illusion, that the veil that we see life through. Even in a Christian sense, apocalypse, which I think is very often mistranslated, it's not the end of days, it's the end of the illusion of time, and it literally means to lift the veil and to see the world as it actually is. And I also heard you say this very interesting thing, that we're not necessarily even in a battle between good and evil, but we're in a battle between the real and the unreal. And I think that's something that's very accurately and acutely spoken of in many of these traditions around the world. So could you speak about these three realms that you delineate, and then also this idea between the real and the unreal? Because again, that's a very cosmovision worldview shifting idea, because we tend to look at reality as something that's very fixed and that it's finite, and that who we are or how we look at the world cannot shape reality. And yet I would imagine you would have a different view upon that.
Yeah, I actually dedicated a number of chapters in my book to this. And so there's a thing called order of creation, and the spirit realm is at the top of that order, and spirit creator created the natural world. Um, but then man created the artificial world. So the fictional realm is a manifestation of our own imagination, our own creation. Um, but it's supposed to be subservient to us. This fiction is supposed to serve us, um, just as we serve spirit. And so when I acknowledge that I'm a spiritual being, I have a foot in the spirit realm. I have a physical body, so I have a foot in the physical realm. But what's happened and what I realize is that the fictional realm has taken on a life of its own because through the manipulation of certain individuals, they've convinced us that the corporation, the root word of corporation is corpus, and corpus is a dead body. And what they've done is they've convinced us to wrap these corporations, these dead bodies around us, creating a corporation soul. S-O-L-E meaning single, not S-O-U-L. So we wrap these dead bodies around us, and we then animate the dead bodies in our daily lives without even being consciously aware of it. And then over time, we start to identify with the dead bodies. So in a lot of my talks in the past, I've often asked people, well, actually, I'll ask you, do you have a driver's license?
I do, yes.
Yeah. So you take a look at your
For a car,
driver's
for a car
license.
and a motorcycle.
So if you take a look at your driver's license, who is that on the driver's license? Is that driver's license you?
It's property of well, I come from the U.S., so it's property of the state, but
Yeah.
ultimately of the state with a capital S, yes.
Yeah. So most people would say, yeah, that's me. They'll point to that picture. Yeah, that's me. That's not you. That's an image of you. That's a likeness of you, but that's not you. Like, if that's you, then who is this beautiful spiritual being sitting in front of me? So people now start to identify themselves with the fiction. So that card is a person. You're not a person. You're a beautiful spiritual being having a physical experience. The person is the corpus. It's the dead body. And whenever we use these dead bodies in our interactions, we're wrapping them around ourselves and we're animating them because the dead body doesn't have a spirit, it doesn't have a voice. The only reason, and Sir William Blackstone mentioned this in his commentaries, the only reason for lawyers is to give the dead bodies a voice in court. If you hire a lawyer, then you're agreeing to be mute and dead and have somebody else speak for you because you can't speak. So this brain twist that took place with the manipulation of the fictional realm has now attempted to turn everything upside down, where the fiction is God and spirit gets dismissed or rejected. And and what I'm suggesting is that is a manipulation. And when I start realizing that I am a spiritual being, that I am not the fiction, and when I return the fiction, I figured out that I can actually live and thrive without the fiction. I've lived now for almost 20 years without a fiction, without the person, proving that we don't actually need the fiction to navigate life. The fiction doesn't have power over me. But when I wrap the fiction around me and become that corporation soul, when authority then comes to act against the fiction, they can act against the body. Or if they act against the body, they act against the fiction. I become one. That's the whole point of SOLE, corporation soul, is you then merge the fiction and the physical together so that they become one. The King of England is a corporation soul. The Pope is a corporation soul. The Governor General of Canada is a corporation soul. And if people don't believe me, they can even go to the Government of Canada website, look up the Governor General's Act, Section 2. It literally says the Governor General is a corporation soul. So that means that they have this corporation, and when they get a new governor general or a new king or a new pope, they remove the physical body and put in a new body and maintain the integrity of the fiction. It's a shell game. And meanwhile, the corporations, these dead bodies, continue to accumulate wealth over and over and over again because they're not allowed to decompose and return the energy back to the living. So all the energy over time is slowly, but now accelerating the acquisition of energy and wealth into the corporate fiction. And as a result, the living are getting poorer and poorer and have access to less and less wealth and resources. And that's how the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And so this whole idea of these three different realms, if we're not consciously aware of it, then how can we fix it? But when I started realizing that, yeah, I am a spiritual being, I have this life through this vessel that was granted to me by Creator. I don't own this vessel either. Like, I'm just borrowing it. When I'm done with it, it will return to Mother Earth, and I will move on. But these fictional constructs, this is the domain of the devil. The third temptation of Christ was all about the devil tempting Christ to bow before him, and he will give him all the kingdoms of the world. But when you look up that word in Scripture, it's not the actual physical land, because that still belongs to Creator. What the devil was tempting Christ with was the right to rule over the world. The right to rule over the world is the domain of the king, and is why 1 Samuel 8 made that warning to the people. And so these fictional constructs, whether it's governments, all the corporations are also constructs of the king too. They all get their charters from the king. And so our challenge now isn't between good and evil, because we all have light and darkness within ourselves. The whole point of doing our work is to shine a light on our darkness and integrate it and embrace it, because it's part of who we are, and that's part of self-governance. But the real challenge is the artificial versus the natural. It's this takeover of the fictional realm to starve out and kill the physical, and control or dismiss the spirit. It will fail. But this is why I'm a huge advocate for not depending on artificial intelligence or corporations or governments or any of that kind of stuff, because all of those institutions and concepts are accelerating this globalist takeover and trying to enslave the world, but also to kill and harvest the world, and I'm not down for that. So I'm an advocate for walking away from the fictional realm, specifically those tools that have been developed, and embrace the kingdom within this, and learn how to govern self, and learn how to navigate our relationships with the natural world through the guidance of spirit.
If you enjoyed my recent interview with Dr. Nathan Bryan and the health effects of nitric oxide, and are curious to work with this very interesting molecule, as listeners of the show, you receive 10% off all orders from their website using the code UNIVERSE at checkout. I really enjoyed my conversation with Dr. Bryan and his holistic approach to health, which really emphasizes not adding on or doing more things, but first focusing on the unhealthy habits diets that limit our own endogenous production of nitric oxide. So focusing on that first and then working to add some supplementation. I think he's doing really good work and is very much in alignment with my own philosophy. So check them out, and I will put a link to their website and the discount code UNIVERSE in the show notes. Could you speak a bit more about that? I mean, I alluded to that concept a little bit earlier, and I think COVID was such a fascinating time because it very much showed the power of the state, and not only individual states but international states. I mean, essentially every country followed the same policies, had the same restrictions. Um, Even things that were beyond the realm of the state, like international travel, became controlled by supranational bodies. What you could put into your body or not put into your body became either directly coerced by supranational bodies or directly enforced by these bodies. You mentioned some interesting things, because I think COVID was so fascinating in that I think it showed a lot of people some of these ideas of these more top-down methods of control, from everything from what we put into our body to these ideas of 15-minute cities, to centralized digital currencies, to digital passports. All of these things, they potentially, it's that idea that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I mean, many of these things have this very alluring feel to them. This kind of sexy, like that would make my life so much easier. What do you see are perhaps what's hidden behind that? Whether either the real intention of that or the natural de facto intentions of these things?
Well, as you ask the question, the thing that keeps popping in my mind is authority. And for me, I acknowledge that I was brainwashed to be obedient to authority my whole entire life. It started with my parents, and then it accumulated through my participation through school, um, and media and movies and all that kind of stuff. But when I start to explore what it means to connect to the kingdom within, the question I had to ask myself is who's the authority? And when I realized, well, I'm the authority with the guidance and protection of Creator, all of a sudden things start to change, because the moment I allow somebody else to make the decision, then I've given my authority away to somebody else. But I also had to heal a lifetime of brainwashing on believing and being obedient to having other people make decisions for me. So when COVID happened, I was already 15 years into my sovereignty, and so for me it was like, no, I'm not going to do that. And it wasn't even a hesitation. It was like, yeah, no, I don't think so. So I didn't participate in it. I didn't even wear a mask through the whole thing. But I was able to navigate it because I didn't have to go into grocery stores or any of that kind of stuff, because I can grow my own food and collect my own water, and I had my own shelter. And so I didn't need to be obedient in order to gain a benefit or a privilege from the system, because I was independent of it. So it was easy for me to not say yes and participate. But even when the trucker convoy happened, to me it was just another example of disobedience, and even bordering on a declaration of war when they started setting up blockades, because a blockade is a declaration of war. And so, yeah, I pissed off a lot of people during COVID because I refused to support or even legitimize the truckers convoy. A lot of people felt it was, empowering and that sort of thing, and to me, it was just a level of disobedience. So yeah, exploring the true nature of authority was really challenging, because I went through years of anxiety and, constantly looking over my shoulder and looking down to the end of the driveway expecting a cop car to be sitting there. It was almost torture trying to deprogram myself. But then I realized this is no different than when I went through the withdrawal symptoms when I was going through healing my addictions. The drug addictions, alcohol, all that kind of stuff. Um, yeah, it was really challenging going through that healing process and the withdrawals. And yeah, now that I think about it, um, withdrawing from my addiction to authority was no different. And it took years of work and healing to find that peace and um, calm my nervous system and find that self-confidence and that ability to be able to stand in my truth, to stand in my own authority and not be intimidated by people who are making claims against me. And one of the tools that I use to help me with that is, again, this comes from Scripture. Christ said, agree with thy adversary quickly, lest you be brought before a judge and put into jail. And so that's what I do is, I agree with people that make claims against me, especially the state. Um, the good news is that I can put the burden of proof on them, because the burden of proof belongs to the one making the claim. And because of all the knowledge and experience I've come with, acquired over the years, my burden is really, really big, and they can't meet those burdens, so they leave me alone. They can no longer prove their claim, and so that's helped me to find peace within myself, knowing that, yeah, if the state ever has a claim against me, um, they'll leave me alone, and they have. I've had numerous instances over the years of the state making claims, and I send them a conditional acceptance, and they just go away. And to a point now where I'm in a process right now where I'm emancipating land from the domain of the crown. By exactly that, I'm asking the king to prove his claim over the land. And he can't, because he has engaged in genocide and extortion and conflict of interest and all that kind of stuff, which violates spiritual law, which he swore an oath to uphold. I'm challenging him on his own oath. And as a result, I'm able to live off the land, live with the land, be the land for free. I live on $100, $150, $200 a month to pay for my telecommunications so that I can have conversations like this with people like you. Or, acquire a few things that I can't make myself. And that's one of the reasons why I want to build Tribe 2, is because I want to get to a point where I don't need money, because all my needs are met through my community. And I'm almost there, like I'm that close. But I've lived off the land for several years now for free, and not harassed by the king. In fact, I even got a letter from the lieutenant governor acknowledging me and sending me her best wishes. And so when we stand in proper standing and we emancipate ourselves the proper way, we'll be acknowledged, not attacked. And I believe that that's Creator protecting us. I, I believe that even the king knows that jurisdiction is extremely important, and if he doesn't have jurisdiction, he will stand down. He won't attack. He won't intimidate or any of that sort of thing. But he will test people. People attempting to emancipate themselves, he will test them to make sure that they're absolutely convinced and ready for what it means to self-govern and to walk a path of peace. I have been tested many, many times. But I know over the last number of years, I've been left alone. And that's because I stand in my own authority.
There's a beautiful quote by a woman who I have a lot of respect for. Her name is Byron Katie, and she says it only takes one person to stop a war. And I think that's very counterintuitive. I mean, even when we think about peace, we de facto think that it's two sides to end the war, that they both have to come to some sort of agreement. But I think one of the really interesting things you're doing is actually very much embodying that idea that she's speaking of, that it only takes one person to end a war, and that's real power. Even this idea, like even your website, the Pesa Marps as opposed to martial arts, it's I think touching on that idea, and this idea of peace. I think it's so beautiful, and even you speak of these ideas of like decolonization, which I think are really there's a truth to them, and yet so often when I hear those words being used, it's very often coming from a place of aggression, of replicating the same systems that they're fighting against, of categorizing, putting people in boxes, saying certain people are good, certain people are bad. Where, and I know this is a long process for you, but can you speak more about that idea of peace? Because perhaps that there's no higher ideal that we could strive for. I mean, it could be love, but that idea of peace, it's such a high ideal, and I think it's something. Even this idea you mentioned of like tranquility, I think there's a deep longing in the human soul for that, and yet there's so many things that keep us from that. Exterior, but also interior, which I think is a big part of all of our journey. But even why you chose, even for example, your craft, your teaching to refer to it in the idea of peace.
Yeah, that's it actually came about because I trained in the martial arts. I've trained in Taekwondo for about 10 years, and I hold a third degree black belt in Taekwondo. But one of the things that I learned by studying the martial art is where the line is, because a lot of people think being peaceful means being a pushover and, vulnerable to attack. But for me, this is about intent. So if we have a scenario where, let's say you're the aggressor and you're coming at me to punch me or kick me, your intent is to do harm, to attack, to go to war. So my simple gesture of blocking your punch or your kick is in self-defense, is to preserve peace. But if you get hurt with my block, that's actually on you, not me, because of your intent. Now, where I cross the line is if I then start to attack you to hurt you. Now I've gone to war, and I've crossed the line. So knowing where the line is really important. Peace doesn't mean I'm an easy pushover. Peace means that I know where the line is, and I've chosen not to cross that line and go to war. So I envision a chessboard, and people on the chessboard are at war, whether they're consciously aware of it or not. And I've consciously decided to walk off the board. And that chessboard is the jurisdiction of the king. And the moment I walked off the chessboard, I'm outside of his jurisdiction. So every citizen, every card holder, everybody's participating through benefits and privileges and all that sort of thing is at war. I've chosen peace, so I had to walk off the chessboard. But I also had to make sure that I know where the line is, because the moment I cross that line, he's going to go to war against me and I'll lose because he's got the bigger military. But where my power comes from isn't through military, it's through spirit. Walking off the chessboard allows me to walk into the kingdom within. And that's a different jurisdiction. And that jurisdiction requires peace and love and compassion and empathy and prosperity to replenish the earth. That's heaven on earth. And I needed to know the difference between the two so that I don't get compelled to go back to war. And when I said, the king will test me, yeah, people poke and prod and try to provoke all the time to go to war because that's what they're used to. But through a lot of healing and conscious awareness and knowing where the boundaries are, helps me to make sure that I don't go to war. And it's hard sometimes. That's the temptation. That's the devil's domain. And that's the human condition. That's the hero's journey, is how do we bring enough conscious awareness so that we know where the line is and we don't cross that line. It's been a huge challenge. It's not easy, but I've worked hard at it. And the Pace Arts is a way for me to explore setting up a program similar to the martial arts, where we train on a regular basis, daily, weekly, whatever it should be, so that we can practice this art form, practice the art of peace, practice the art of love, because it's going to require the same level of dedication, commitment, and skills that the martial arts demanded when I trained in the martial arts. You know, sadly, it's been a real challenging art form to teach, because the people that are interested are spread out all over the world. So it's really hard for us to gather physically on a regular basis to train. I pray one day we'll get there, but we're not there yet. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. What does your life look like? I mean, being emancipated at this point, and also I would imagine it's important not to set a standard that that's what one's life should look like, because people's lives can look like many different things. But for you personally, what does your life look like now? Like, what are your routines? What is your home like? What does that mean when you're no longer a part of the state? I mean, I would imagine you don't have a driver's license, a passport, you're not paying taxes. How does that look like for you?
Well, I got to a point, like, 2022 through 2024, 2025, where, I was living on the land, and I was comfortable. I was growing my own food and collecting my own water. I built my own house. I could have lived there till the end of my life. But it was also me being alone there on the land. So I actually left the land and started traveling across Turtle Island, what people call Canada, to connect with people and teach and build tribe, to be more accessible, to go to the people instead of trying to get the people to come to me, because I was like way out there in the bush. I was, 6, 8 hours away from any major city. So right now, I'm inland in BC, working to emancipate some land near here so that I can build a lodge, build shelters so that we have a place for people to land, we have a place to train, we have a place, if people are homeless, that they can come um, and learn how to steward themselves, steward the land, how to manage their own home fire, how to grow their own gardens, how to do ceremony, how to make decisions within tribes, how to navigate relationships, how to heal, how to learn all the skills that are required for this type of living. I'm actually going to be traveling to Vancouver Island here in a few weeks to do the same there. Um, I have an interest to set up what I call land arcs. And so this gets back to now something that happened a few years ago, because while I was sitting in Ontario on this land that I emancipated, um, Spirit asked me to invoke the Moses archetype to emancipate that land. And so that's what I did, is I spoke to the king and, let my people go kind of thing, to emancipate the land, because the people are the land. And then Spirit asked me to invoke the Noah archetype to build land arcs, because the next cleansing isn't going to be by water, it's going to be by fire. And so I'm working on building land arcs to emancipate small islands of land where people can go to remove themselves from the jurisdiction of the king, to then rebuild our tribes and stand as stewards of the land while these fictional constructs literally start burning to the ground. And I've been asked by many divine feminine to build bridges to help people transition from this colonial way of life, to decolonize themselves, to then embrace our true nature. Like, we are tribal people. There's no shame in that. Yes, tribes fought and went to war, but that's again a reflection of the human condition, not of the sacred nature of what tribes are actually there to do, and that's to make sure that we're all protected and provided for and supported through supporting each individual's sovereignty. So these land arcs are something that I've been asked to do to try to help in this transition. So through that process, I do a lot of writing. I do podcasts like this, but I also spend a lot of my time planting gardens. Like right now, I'm deep in garden planting mode. And we went through a whole process here of fire smarting the land, where we harvested about half of the trees, because it was all just a monoculture crop here, to allow the diversity of trees and plants and animals to return, to restore the land to the way it should be, where it's prosperity for all life, not just for one species or two species, which also then reduced the risk of wildfire and death and destruction through this mismanagement of the land by the corporate fictions. So I do a lot of reading and studying and writing yeah, I still do my own laundry and wash my dishes and I cook my own food and um, you know like they said, before enlightenment, you haul water and plant gardens, and after enlightenment you haul water and plant gardens. Like um, but I work hard to focus on my relationships, and I've found over the years that I can't navigate thousands of relationships through social media and that sort of thing. I only have the capacity to really build deep, intimate connections with just a handful of people. And that's the other reason why tribes are so important, is because um, I'm not interested in 1,000 shallow relationships. I want a dozen or two deeply intimate, vulnerable, highly connected relationships with people. That's where the profound satisfaction and content that I find in my life comes from. I don't want shallow. I don't want convenient. I don't want quick. I want to do the work, and I want to cry and laugh and play and be with people that want to do the same and that are doing the work to heal and be vulnerable and authentic and and that work is done in the physical. It's not done remotely like what we're doing here. We can have a certain level of intimacy this way, but it's profoundly challenging and deeply rewarding when it becomes face to face. And that's another reason why tribe is so important. So these are the things that I work on. This is what I'm interested in. I don't have a job. I don't have a desire to make lots of money or that sort of thing. Because again, my values, my definition of wealth is different than the colonial definitions. So for me, I feel I'm a wealthy man because I have beautiful people in my life that are willing and able to navigate the complexities and nuances of deeply emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual connection with one another.
It was interesting when you said, like, if you had a heart attack, you wouldn't want 911 to come, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's an aspect of that no one owes us a service, in a sense that we don't have a right to someone else's work, their time, their effort. And we also then begin to buy into that system. And there's a great comfort in this promise that someone will look after us. We look to the state, to religion, to the Pope, to the Buddha, that there's someone that will look after us. And there's a great comfort in that, but as you said, it absolves a certain responsibility, and ultimately freedom is standing naked in the face of God and being completely responsible for our lives. And so I think that path of, again, whatever it's called, decoupling oneself from the state, and you alluded to this a bit, that there's a tremendous fear around that. There's a tremendous apprehension, but because it is something extremely scary to be free of all of that. We all say we want freedom, but as it begins to come, that there's something terrifying about that, because it is in the end just then a direct relationship with Creator. What was that? What was that process like for you? And I think maybe it was on Shonagh's interview. You said something very beautiful, but when you allowed yourself to do that, you noticed magic beginning to happen. And I think that's something I found for myself too. Not that I've completely freed myself, but the moments to the degree that I have done that, that have been very challenging, there is a magic that begins to happen. And I think you spoke about this of this direct communication with spirit, whether it's through numbers or animals or feelings or somatic experiences or revelations. And this is something that all religion speaks about is actually to have a direct relationship with spirit. I mean, these ideas of Noah or Moses, these were people who didn't operate through the realm of man. They received this knowledge directly from spirit. And so I think we all understand that on some intellectual level, but to actually do that is a huge, huge feat. And I think there's something ultimately very terrifying for people. Obviously you're still in a process like everyone, but and you alluded to, even this idea, which I can imagine, of these periods of your life of looking over your shoulder, that there would be police in the driveway, or I mean, I would imagine probably you've been worried that you would be killed, even just for potentially being an impetus or a tool or a voice of very, very powerful systems. If someone is thinking about that, or has that inclination, or some calling, is there something you can say from your own life, your own experience, that would perhaps give them comfort in that path that they're embarking upon?
Yeah, it was definitely a leap of faith. Um, it took me years to get to a point where I trusted that spirit was protecting me. I know that now, and so that allows me to be able to take more risks, things that I may not have, risks that I may not have taken years ago. Um, but there's also a shift in perception that I went through too, where the old me had this expectation that others would come and save me or rescue me. Um, but the expectation then put me into a place where I felt entitled. I felt entitled to be looked after, um, and it's that entitlement that really put me at odds with other people, um, because entitlement is a form of abuse. Um, and so I really had to challenge myself on expectations. Um, and this has been work that I've been doing over the last 2 or 3 years. This is new work for me. To a point now where I'm exploring the idea that, when we go into tribe, this isn't about give and take, because that entitlement is about taking. And this is a lesson that I learned from the Red Tribes, is if I'm to honor the sovereignty of the tree, or the sovereignty of the deer, or the sovereignty of the snake, or the eagle, or the raven, or whoever, this isn't about me going and taking their life. And this goes at odds too with people when it comes to being carnivores or omnivores, or you know vegan or vegetarian. Um, whether it's a plant or an animal, they are a sacred sovereign being, and I don't have an expectation, or I shouldn't have an expectation of them being available for me to just take in order to nourish my body. So that forced me then to change my relationship and how I approach my relationship to all other beings. And Derek Jensen, he wrote a book called Language Older Than Words. And he helped me to start realizing that if I ask for permission, these spiritual beings will grant, if they choose, for me to then use their body. So instead of it being a taking, I'm now receiving their gift. All the plants and animals are here to help us learn how to steward with benevolence and respect and honor. And where the red tribes taught me is, that's why, we carry tobacco, is it's a reminder to ask, and when we do get permission, to give thanks to that spiritual being for their sacrifice to nourish us or clothe us or provide for us, to honor their spirit. But if we just take without that honor, without asking, then we've disrespected their spirit. We've disrespected the contribution that they've made, and violated spiritual law. So part of this whole journey is to heal so that I can let go of this entitlement. I'm not entitled to anything. Instead, this is a leap of faith in spirit, to trust that spiritual being somewhere will offer themselves to me to nourish me, whether it's through food or clothing or whatever. And that's a process I'm still going through, and I think that's going to be a lifelong journey, is to explore what that looks like, because it's very foreign to how I grew up most of my life. And I still forget sometimes and disrespect the spirit of the plants or the animals, and it's like, okay, yep, working on this. Please forgive me. I forgive myself. And forgiveness is a huge part of this, because I made lots of mistakes. And I'm getting better at forgiving myself. I think I'm doing pretty good at forgiving others now, where, I'm not letting them trigger me. There's still a few people I have challenges with, but I'm working on forgiveness. But to let go of that entitlement and explore trusting that I will receive what I need. But that also means that I'm freely giving of my gifts. That's why I give my book away for free, and I write for free on social media, and I do podcasts for free. I tried in the past and to sell the information, and it just didn't feel right. It felt icky, and so I just give it away for free, because I trust that what I need I will receive. I give my time freely to you, and I don't expect anything from you, because I know that I will receive elsewhere. So there's no expectations, there's no entitlement, just a leap of faith in spirit, that spirit will provide for me one way or another. And spirit has. Like, I've done this for 20 years, and I've never gone a day without a roof over my head. I've never gone without food in my belly or clothes, or I've been able to travel and all kinds of things. Even though if I was to be judged based on colonial standards, I'd be piss poor broke, because I don't have material things, material wealth, other than just clothes and a few tools. That's all I have physically. So it's a leap of faith, and learning to trust that.
You mentioned this idea of relationships quite a few times, and I think it's very interesting, because even even when we speak, again, broadly speaking, for lack of better words, this idea of spirit usually entails one, or even that which is beyond one, but we compartmentalize it into oneness. Even the Tao Te Ching says very beautiful that the Tao gave birth to the one gave birth to the two to the three to the 10,000 things, the infinite things. But we often speak of this world as the world of duality, of man and woman, night and dark, good and bad, real and unreal. And, with that, there's a de facto relationship to that. It means that everything is in relationship. Everything has its opposite. So we literally exist because there's something else. There's something specific else, and that there's everything else. So we are a creature of duality. We're a creature of manifestation, which means that we're always in relationship to everything, to water, to fire, to the winds, to the water. And a big part of my work is actually working with tobacco. And it's very interesting when people go into a direct relationship with a plant. Very often we come expecting these huge things and changes, and all of that is real and possible within the domain of potentialities. But we also work on these very fundamental pillars, these pillars of the house, which are all relations: the relationship to my family, the relationship to my loved ones, my relationship to work, to the realm of money, the relationship to all of the people in my life, and extrapolating again into infinite relationships. How has that become a pillar? Because it really seems you're putting a lot of focus on that now, which I think is so fascinating. Because in our day-to-day lives, obviously, even when we think of relationships, usually the only thing we're very often thinking of is maybe our love relationship, or maybe to some degree our family relationships. But this idea of relationship on a deeper level, and how that's so important. And I think, as you very wisely said, in many indigenous or traditional societies around the world, there's a very, very deep importance placed on relationship. And even to the point of, in our own Western medical sense, that's what dis-ease is. It's a bad relationship. There's a dysbiosis rather than a symbiosis.
Yeah, I realized after my recovery that, because I asked myself, like, what's my purpose here? Like, I was feeling good, but then realizing, like, why am I here? And that's when I started asking these questions, and realizing that this is all about relationship. And when I went through my recovery, it was about my relationship with myself, learning how to love myself, learning how to set boundaries and communicate feelings and navigate relationship. And then I started exploring my relationship with Creator, with Spirit, and which led me then to my relationship with the plants and the animals and with family. But then I started exploring this relationship between divine feminine and divine masculine, and realizing that I have both within myself to build this personal container, which then helped me to then explore what it meant to build a container for divine feminine, and then realize that I can't build the container for tribe by myself. I need other men and women to help me build that tribal container, because I see divine masculine as the builder of the container. Divine feminine, she's the architect. She's the one that sees everything and how everything's interconnected and interwoven, and can identify the needs. And the divine masculine energy is about building that container to hold and meet those needs. There's other things too, but it's all part and parcel of the exploration of all these relationships. But you speak of duality, and for me, the duality is there to help build strength and awareness. Like in the martial arts, we used gravity and resistance to build strength physically and speed and flexibility and that sort of thing. But I also know that there's a lot of other resistances in the world to help us build strength emotionally, build mental strength, but also build spiritual strength too. And without that resistance, it would atrophy. Pardon me. And for me, I feel that that's part of the duality. So this duality between masculine and feminine, we're there to help each other. We're different creatures. We see the world differently. We interact in relationships differently. But that's a beautiful thing. It helps me. Like, I'm exploring relationship with divine feminine right now, and we have been for a year and a half. And I went into this relationship under a completely different premise that I've approached all the past relationships, including my ex-wife, and the premise being that I'm not going into this relationship through conquest, but rather vulnerability and connection and intimacy on a physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual level. And that changed the whole dynamic of what I'm experiencing within relationship. We don't actually live together. We live, 3 hours apart. But we're in communication each day. She visits a couple times a month. But it's profoundly rewarding and enriching experience. And, I would love to build a land ark, and I would love to build her a shelter and a garden, and I'll have shelter and a garden for me, and help her explore and connect with her own sovereignty and her own independence, because this isn't about me owning, controlling, or manipulating divine feminine. This is about me giving my gifts to empower her own sovereignty, her own voice, her own capacity to express her divine feminine. And that can only be done within a safe masculine container. And I've found in the past where, my inability to navigate relationship in a healthy way and to own and control and manipulate to try to, gain my own sexual satisfaction was actually a suppression and a harm to divine feminine. So how can I build a container to honor her sovereignty, honor her free will, her sacred divine feminine, and hold container for her to explore her independence without expectation. There's no expectation that she be with me or any of that sort of thing. I'm not trying to control her or claim her or any of that kind of stuff. And it was actually the grouse that helped me explore this, because the grouse is the one that stands on the log. The male is the one that, makes that beating sound on his chest to attract the female. And it's the female that chooses whether the male is worthy or not. So for me, it's what can I do to build my container so that it looks safe, it is safe, to allow her to pour herself into that container to be able to open up and be free. But she needs to feel safe, held, and secure in that. And her opening up isn't an invitation for me to penetrate that energy or that body. It still requires invitation. And this is a whole new approach to relationship that I hadn't explored before. and it required that duality to be able to figure that out. And I have, a tremendous amount of gratitude and appreciation for a dear friend of mine. I met her through a decolonization ceremony that I held about 4 or 5 years ago, and she's the one that held space for me to start exploring these kind of questions, and it really opened up myself to the possibility of, how do I really honor and respect the divine feminine. And that's why I believe that we can't own land. This isn't about owning the land, because ownership is enslaving divine feminine. But if I have to let go of the concept of ownership, then it's like, how do I navigate life? And so that's what I'm exploring right now, and I'm grateful for these relationships that I have, because it's really having a profound impact on how I relate to all the other relationships that I have in my life. And I'm seeing things very, very differently now, where I want to honor the sovereignty of every spiritual being, whether it's two-legged or four, or the winged or the finned, or the plants, the rocks, the water, even spirit deserves that kind of respect and honor. And how do I approach that? That's what I'm exploring.
It's very interesting because you quote scripture a lot, and I think for many people they have a damaged experience with Christianity. Although interestingly, at the same time, I think there's a resurgence of Christianity. I think probably similar in Canada, but I think in the U.S. that the rates of going to church were really declining with the previous generations. But I think with the youngest generation, they're actually increasing at quite a high rate. And I think a lot of that is this deep longing and some sort of promise of maybe returning to what's seen as a root of something that we could say is our own. Interestingly, at the same time, you were mentioning these ideas of like the King of England who swears an oath to the Bible, or even in the US, many politicians place their hand on the Bible and swear an oath. What, and again, this is a huge question, but what for you is that relationship to Christianity as an idea, as a divine concept, as a representation of truth, and then at the same time within the realm of man, and how that can be used in these ways that you're describing, both for the good and the bad. Potentially the goodness of how a state could use Christianity, but also the usurping of, I think, those fundamental values. And even this idea, I mean, again, going back to COVID, but I do think it was really interesting that some of the staunchest opponents to what could maybe be said as the authoritarian power structures that were beginning to be imposed were very often Christians, because they would say, well, we get our authority from God, and it's not through the state. Now, certainly not all Christians. There's many who I think went along with everything, but it is a very interesting dichotomy. Something that's very prevalent in the societies we come from and the history we come from, something that I think stirs so many different emotions in people. And so I'm just curious if you can expand upon that a bit for you.
Sure. And I spoke about this in my book, but the Bible has gone through manipulation too, and it wasn't until about a year ago I had this epiphany that the colonizer wasn't the white tribes out of Europe. Colonization doesn't have a color of white. The colonizers were the church and the corpus, the dead bodies. It just so happened that the people in Europe were the first to be colonized by the church. And so the Bible is then used as a weapon of colonization as well. And so I have to be careful. So when I study scripture, I work hard to, go back to the roots of the words in the Hebrew or the Greek, and make my own determination, because in the end, it's up to me to interpret and navigate what's being said in the Bible. But I've also found many, many instances where the Bible has been manipulated to enforce and justify colonization. And I go through a number of those examples in my book. One of them, for example, is, the term witch. But witch comes from the root word in Greek, pharmacia. Pharmacia is about drugs. So actually, it's the pharmaceuticals and the pharmacists that are spoken of in the Bible, not witches. But when the Bible was interpreted in the 1600s, they flipped the word so that they can kill the witches. But in the end, we're not supposed to be killing. We're not supposed to be murdering one another. We're not supposed to be judging one another. So for me, when I went through the Bible, I had to have some discernment, because much of the Bible is, what would happen if we're not following the path. And that's where 1 Samuel 8 came in. But I also know there's many truths and many wisdoms. But I had to do my own work and make my own assessment. I'll listen to other people, but in the end, the authority still rests with me to do make my own decisions and make my own assessments. That's the critical thinking that I had to do in order to walk my path. And when I declared my sovereignty in 2008, I realized, well, I need a law form. What law am I going to govern myself by? And that's when I chose Matthew 22, to love God with all my heart, soul, and mind, and to love my neighbor as myself. That's my law form. Which meant I had to learn how to love myself so that I can then express that love to other people. And to me, that resonated with me. It resonated with my spirit. It felt right to make that as my law form. And part of that journey was to acknowledge that, yeah, it's going to trigger people. I know a lot of people are triggered by me quoting scripture, because there is a lot of harm and resentment and anger and pain and trauma as a result of colonization, as a result of the organized religions. And I acknowledge that. I know it's going to take a tremendous amount of time to heal that. But I also know that there's spiritual truth that I can walk my life based on. And and I tried to make that clear in my book, and I appreciate the question too, because it is a common concern that people have expressed to me, because they feel that my message is so important that when I quote scripture that I'm actually scaring people off. But I don't trust the Bible because it was written and manipulated by man, and it's still up to me to have a one-on-one direct connection with Spirit, with Creator. And I don't need the Bible as the sole source to do that. I have that connection with Creator every single moment of every single day, whether I'm walking through the bush or sitting here talking to you or reading a book. It's up to me to discern and navigate that based on the, how I feel, and, does it resonate with what I have come to contemplate what love actually means. Because I know even through my recovery, tough love was applied to me. It wasn't about being, nice and accommodating. When I was going through my recovery, I had some really, really tough questions asked of me, and I was confronted numerous times on my abusive behavior. And when I facilitate my Sacred Heart circles, I have tough questions for people, and that's tough love. Um, and I needed that to heal. And I appreciate the tough love. Love isn't all warm and fuzzy sometimes. Sometimes it's really challenging and confrontational. Um, and even that word confrontation challenges people too, because I'm not talking about war. I'm talking about really challenging people on their perceptions and perceived notions of what truth is and what the reality is, um, and I'm a huge advocate for doing the deep dive into the abyss of our internal selves, because that's where our salvation is. That's where the kingdom is. And sometimes it takes really tough, hard questions to start stripping away a lot of that armor and um, resistance, so that we can really start connecting with who we truly are. And some of that came from scripture. How I challenge people is direct quotes from what Christ was trying to teach. He himself said he didn't come here to bring peace, he came here to bring a sword. And that was, in my view, a direct challenge to how we perceive ourselves and the discomfort that's required to literally cut away the lies and the deception and all that kind of stuff, so we can really explore who we truly are. And that's not easy. Um, but I feel that that's why we're here, and it's extremely important.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that that could be said of all of these spiritual texts that have truth and beauty and wisdom. I mean, the Vedas have been used in not so great ways. I remember being in, I think it was, maybe it was India, where the first Buddhist temple was, and it was a little mud brick structure that allegedly the Buddha said, reluctantly said, you can create this as a place of worship, even though he apparently didn't like the idea, but certainly not to have any idolatry, no images of him. And then you look at the modern temples, which are ornate and golden and huge Buddha statues, and you can look at the Quran or the texts of Zoroaster. And it's interesting being in South America, because they are such syncretic cultures, and very interestingly, so many of these Amerindian or indigenous First Nation groups in South America very much incorporated Christianity into their worldviews. And so even though they have very highly evolved shamanic practices, they very much incorporate aspects of Christianity. And I think that's a very beautiful way of operating. There's a teacher I have. He comes from a group of people called the Tubu in the Colombian Amazon, and they have these beautiful stories. And they say we're entering the time of the Diro Amasa, the children of the new dawn, and it's the people who have different skin colors, hair colors, eye colors, but that they're able to take the medicine of the four directions and to bridge that, to create a new Maloka, a new earth, something beyond even the realm of time and space. And very interestingly, a big part of his work, and I'd like to ask you about the Sacred Heart circles, because a big part of the healing work of the Tubu sounds quite similar. They sit people in ceremony, in communal ceremonies, groups of people, often to resolve conflict between individuals. It could be between families, but it's seen that conflict can be toxic. It can be an energy that destroys. Even interestingly, in Gabon, where they work with iboga as a sacrament. It was very interesting. I learned of this story where even things like jealousy, like a woman had jealousy, and the whole community came together to work in a ceremonial way to resolve that, because it was seen that that energy could create destruction within the group, could bring dysbiosis, disharmony. And this idea of how Amika works and the Tubu is through ceremony, through sitting people, through the sacraments, through these sacred plants, through these rituals, these stories, and through this very deep, very, I think, highly technological process of the power of the word, bringing healing to that so that the tribe can flourish. And even it's interesting because he would say that through this practice, even through the recounting of the stories, the legends, there's healing codes that are built into these, that when we hear this, when we receive the power of the word, that there's a healing that can take place. And a huge part of that is through this idea of relationships and bringing things out into the open, making it manifest. So I think that's really fascinating what you're doing with these sacred heart circles. Could you speak a bit more about that and what formed that for you and what that process looks like?
Yeah. The idea came, like I've been doing Sacred Heart Circles now for almost 10 years. The idea came actually from the circle I was in during my recovery, because I was in a group of 40 people where we worked 8 hours a day, 5 days a week for 18 weeks. And what I really liked about the circle was that there was certain ground rules, like we weren't allowed to leave, so there's no running away, this flight response if we got triggered. There's we had to be on time. If you're late, then you're locked out and you're not welcome to come back. Like, lots of boundaries to really set the framework for discipline. But then when we're in the circle, there's also, there's no shaming and guilting people, because we need a safe space to be vulnerable and to share things that terrified us. And so I had an opportunity to share things that I thought I would never share ever in my life. And it took me a long time to find the courage to do that, but I eventually did get there. And I had the opportunity to explore things that happened in my childhood so that I can put it into proper context, because when we're young, when we're little kids, we don't have the emotional and mental maturity to be able to interpret events properly. I had a tendency to, blame myself and not feel worthy, and, dealing with abandonment and neglect and, all kinds of trauma. But as an adult, I can start doing that work and looking after that little boy inside of me so that I can start nurturing him and looking after him instead of feeling abandoned by other people because they're not looking after him. And this is, goes to learning how to be responsible and accountable as well too. This is about physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual maturity. For, first half of my life, I was not emotionally or mentally mature. I was physically mature, but nor spiritually mature. And so my Sacred Heart Circles are a place where I work hard to build a safe place for people to share. We do it as a ceremony. I do a smudge and a prayer to open a circle, and everybody has an opportunity to check in, and so everyone has a voice, and and I'm not here to tell people what to do or what to think or any of that kind of stuff. So instead, I ask questions, and a lot of the questions sometimes come from spirit, sometimes it comes from my own personal experience. But the questions are designed to help people challenge themselves and be able to make their own decisions and come to their own conclusions. to learn how to look after their little boy or the little girl, to learn how to be vulnerable and feel safe and navigate relationship and to be able to communicate. But even to just even be able to connect to their feelings and feel safe to cry, to weep, to grieve, to feel the sadness, to feel the pain. Because this is a Sacred Heart Circle. You know, a lot of my experience, I have a very strong intellect, so I was hugely intellectual and completely blocked off my heart and my emotions. And my experience was to connect into my heart and start feeling. And so that's what I do in the Sacred Heart Circles too, is I'll sometimes people get onto a tangent about, this story, and it's like, you know, helping them reconnect with their heart so they can start to feel. Because in the end, how I communicate with Mother Earth and the plants and the animals is through feeling. That's how this world communicates, is through feeling. We have the intellect as a tool to help us navigate that, but the communication and connection come through feeling. And that's how I communicate with the trees and plants and the animals. But I couldn't do that until I'd gone through my healing process. And so through the Sacred Heart Circle, it's an opportunity to be in a safe space where we can learn how to feel again. And I found that when I did that, the vast majority of my addictions just went away, because the addictions were an attempt to avoid feeling out of fear or out of pain or that sort of thing. But you know what? I love crying now. I feel comfortable grieving. I feel comfortable feeling pain because I've come to connect with it, respect it, and honor it. And I want to hold space to help people be able to do that as well too, so that we can embrace all of who we are. So I work hard to embrace all of who I am, because I'm not just joy. I have sadness too. I have pain. I have happiness. I have all of these feelings, and they're all valid. This isn't about good and bad feelings. There's all feelings are sacred. We just have good or bad outcomes when we ignore our feelings. And because some people have addictions, when they feel happy, they can't stand feeling happy, so they'll shop or they'll do other things, or it's it's all kind of distorted. But when we really start connecting with our feelings and feeling comfortable with all of them, then we can start finding that peace, and that's where the balance starts to come in, and and ceremony is an important tool to do that. Ceremony is about consciously taking time to do the work. And even in tribe building, we're constantly sitting down and talking. We're constantly navigating relationships, and it's uncomfortable. It's dealing with the iggly and nigglies, and but it's important so that we can get to a point where it is comfortable, it is familiar. And yeah, I sometimes use those two words, but people talk about comfort zone, but I call it a familiarity zone, because there are things that people that are familiar to them, but it's very uncomfortable. And I would suggest that how people feel about the state and the current world affairs and all that kind of stuff and relationships, it's familiar, but it's really uncomfortable, but they're still doing it because it's familiar. And so what I speak of and what we do in the Sacred Heart Circles is, let's expand that familiarity zone so that everything is familiar, and so that when we're dealing with things that are uncomfortable, we have something else that's familiar that we can do to help resolve the discomfort and find that peace within ourselves. But that requires healing, that requires communication and critical processes to really evaluate the truth of that, so that we can heal and integrate our shadows and do that deep dive into the abyss and bring the armor down and remove that armor that we've put up to protect ourselves, so that we can feel safe when we're vulnerable. And that's what the Sacred Heart Circle is all about.
This has been amazing. I think we could probably talk for another 3 hours. I think we're almost coming up on 3 hours now. Maybe as we begin to wrap up, with that idea of ceremony and ritual, how much, because that seems like, certainly in our Western world, we have certain ceremonies, certain rituals, but I think they're more maybe remnants, or they've lost a deeper meaning. How much do you think, like it seems like a lot of our ills and woes actually come from that loss of, even this idea that you spoke of, you've pushed yourself in many ways, whether it was through abusive drugs or stepping out of that, which is maybe even more challenging, and stepping out of these power structures, this idea of sovereignty, of going into ceremonies, of beginning to examine deeply yourself. And these are practices you see in traditional societies all over the world, as these very specific times of really going into a process of self-inquiry, whether it's through a vision quest, of fasting, of isolating oneself, or being in community. But this idea of ritual, this idea of ceremony, this idea of I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. Maybe not making yourself less comfortable, but expanding the zones of familiarity. How important do you think that is in kind of this idea of reshaping the earth, beginning to connect us to this place that I think so many people are longing for, which is a sense of community, of belonging, of peace, tranquility, love, through this idea of some ceremonial or ritualistic aspect?
Yeah.
And sorry, even just to sorry to interject. I mean, even this aspect of martial arts, I think, is something so beautiful. I mean, I practice jujitsu myself. I practiced a number of martial arts, but jujitsu for I think almost 17 years now, and I still don't have my black belt. But even that there's something extremely humbling and in community, a sense of self-exploration, a sense of testing oneself, expanding one's zone of familiarity, of testing the real. But it seems like we've gone away from a lot of these things. So yes, sorry to interrupt, but just to touch on that idea of martial arts, because I think that's a very interesting part of your life as well.
Yeah, and that's how I was going to start answering the question is, go back to my martial arts training, because, when I was training, I was doing 3 nights a week, 9 hours a week kind of thing. And it was that discipline that helped me to heal, because I started my martial arts training right after I recovered. So my recovery, that 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, 18 weeks, that provided discipline for me to do the work. And then I went into martial arts to continue the discipline. So I had a discipline to help me integrate and practice what I learned. And in fact, the martial arts reinforced and actually had similar lessons that I learned in my recovery. And now that I'm no longer training in the martial arts, I'm finding that through the work of tribe building, the ceremony is important, because it provides a framework for discipline, to have that space to be able to do the work. And and that's why I do my Sacred Heart Circles every Wednesday evening. It's to provide discipline. It's to provide a space, and that's what ceremony is for. It's not to create more dogma, because it can go too far. I've seen lots of people that move ceremony into dogma, which is no different than organized religions and that sort of thing. That's why the balance is always important, because too little is too little of something can be a trauma. Too much of something can be a trauma. So balance requires that fine tuning in the middle and not going to either extreme. Um, but the ceremony, I find, is a place that provides that rigid structure to have the discipline so we can do the work. Rigid structure meaning timing, not that there's rigidity in the ceremony itself, because spirit still comes to play. Spirit has its say, and I found through a decade of doing retreats and ceremonies and all that sort of thing that it never goes to plan, and spirit always has a say and will always orchestrate things within ceremony. And I know it's a good ceremony when spirit does that, when it doesn't go to plan. When everything is really rigid and structured, then spirit doesn't have a chance to come and play and help. So I know that I've gone too far when things like that happen. But it's the discipline, and I found that self-love, freedom, the process of emancipation, sovereignty, all requires a tremendous amount of self-discipline, because self-governance isn't about I can do whatever I want. That kind of mentality is chaotic. Just like a governor on an engine, the governor is there to ensure that the engine doesn't go too fast and fly itself apart, or go too slow and stall. So with self-governance, with sovereignty, with the healing, it requires that I learn how to govern myself, which is to self-restrict, so that I don't go too far one way or too little the other way, because one is neglect and the other is harm. And that's the challenging part, is to find that middle ground. And for me, I needed a tool to be able to help me do that. And so I have now built my own ceremonies. I meditate, I pray, I do Sacred Heart circles. I make sure I spend time, set time aside to be with people, to maintain that balance. But if I don't do it, it doesn't happen. So I needed to learn how to discipline myself to make sure that I'm doing my due diligence to maintain my sovereignty and maintain my relationships, and not have expectations of other people, but still reach out and send the invitations and receive the gifts that I receive from other people, and offer my gift to other people, so that we can have this gift and receive. And yeah, it's been a journey, but for me the ceremony has been a core component of it, whether it's in martial arts training or pace arts training.
This is maybe another big question to end, but where do you see the world going? Where do you see, because again, when we speak of this idea of polarities, it seems like on the one hand, there are these more and more systems of control, supranational authorities, things that, even as you said, the gap of the rich and the poor, and potentially even disillusion of the middle class, and At the same time, it seems like there's seeds of people awakening, of longing, of reaching out to other forms. Do you have any insight of where you see that going, and maybe at the same time where you see your life moving towards?
Well, I've tried to predict where the world is going for 20 years, and I've been wrong for the most part. But um, I'll share with you what I feel. And I feel that the world is going to go through the same change or die decision that I went through 20 years ago. Um, there's going to be a watershed moment that each individual would need to make. Um, some are choosing it willfully. Some may have to go through hell to get there. You know, like I went the hell route, and it was ugly and painful and scary and really really dark. Other people are using their free will and making the choice without going that far down. Um, but I also see there's a lot of people that are choosing the dark route, and I see a lot of ugliness and pain and suffering on that path. But I also know, like you said, there's lots of people that are doing the work, and there's islands all over the place of beautiful people that are, doing the work and choosing that path of love, um, and what they're building is beautiful. You know, I've said in the past, might be 8 billion different solutions to this problem that we're facing, but in the end, it's down to each individual making that choice to do the work. And I'll, I'll, I believe we'll eventually see the dismantling of the fictional constructs because we won't need them anymore. They're tools that will no longer be needed. I believe that we have the capacity through spirit and through really connecting with the true talents and gifts of our physical body to be able to do anything that any fictional construct or any technology has the capacity to do. We'd be able to have these conversations without the computers. I've had Red Tribe members in my living room talking about how their ancestors used to levitate rocks, and they would stand on the rocks and travel that way. Um, Even Christ said that when we're ready, we'll be able to do miracles even greater than what he was able to do. So, do I have hope and optimism for the future? Absolutely. It's going to be way, way beyond what any of us can imagine, because we're extremely powerful beings when we really start to connect with our true spirit and start to emancipate ourselves from this slave fiction that we created. But what it looks like, I'm not going to make any predictions because I have no idea what it's going to look like. And will I be able to see it in my lifetime? I pray I do.
Well, this has been a beautiful and I think very profound conversation. And thank you not only for your time, but really for all you're doing. It takes very courageous people to begin to shift. I think true visionaries to be willing to stand naked, and that's always how history works. Is people take that leap of faith, and then that creates a doorway for other people to do it. And so I think you're doing something very very noble, very beautiful. So I can only imagine the sacrifice that it's taken and the toll, but. Whether it's in this life or the next, you'll be rewarded for that. And so just thank you so much. And if people are interested in reading your book or reaching out to you, communicating with you, doing your course, the Pace Arts, what's the best way for them to reach out?
Probably the best way is through email, white.walking.feather@gmail.com, or whitewalkingfeather at protonmail.com. Um, I'm
A number of years
also
ago, I switched over everything to Proton, and I feel it was one of the better choices I made.
I'm also on Facebook, so people can find me there if they search for Rob in the Pagé family there. And my website, pacemarts.com. That's pacemarts.com. My book is pinned on my Facebook wall, but they can also download it for free off my website as well too. And I have lots of podcasts and videos and stuff, audios on my website, and thousands of commentary posts on Facebook as well too. And a good place to start is reading my book, Graduating
Well,
Life Without It.
amazing. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And I wish you all the best. And this will be out maybe in a month. And feel free to use it, share it. It's as much yours as it is mine. And I really wish you all the best. I hope we keep in touch and one day our paths cross. And again, thank you for all you're doing.
Thank you, Jason, for the honor of sharing time with you today. I don't like saying spending time, because we don't spend it, we share it, we gift it to one another. So I want to express my gratitude and appreciation to you for your gift of time to me, and for the opportunity to share my story with you and the people that follow your work. And so I express gratitude and appreciation for all that you're doing, and for reaching out to me and wanting to connect. And I love you and appreciate you, and I pray that Spirit helps protect you and guide you on your journey. And thank you very much for this gift of time today.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate that. That is it. I hope you enjoyed that episode. For me, it was really fascinating sitting down and talking with White Walking Feather, with Rob. Um, I think he has a tremendous amount of wisdom to share, maybe some interesting ideas for some people, maybe even very far out, but hopefully after listening to this, some things began to open or perhaps shift in our worldview and our consciousness, the way we see and think and understand about things. So thank you very much to him for all he's done and for coming on and sharing. Thank you all for tuning in. As always, if you're able to support this podcast, that's a really big help to me. Patreon is a really amazing website. You can sign up for as little as $1 a month. There's different tiers you can sign up for. Those tiers also give you different things back, things like early access to shows, bonus material, Q&As. As always, thank you so much to the people supporting that way. And if you're able to, thank you very much in advance. And if not, as always, just helping with the algorithms is a really big help. So if you're viewing this on YouTube, hitting the subscribe button, turning on the notification bell, liking the video. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcast or Spotify, leaving a starred rating, a short review is great. And then finally, if you're interested in working with myself, you can find all of my work on nicotianarustica.org, working one-on-one, health consultations, integration sessions, and plant dietas. So you can find all of that there. I hope this finds you all well. Thank you again so much for tuning in, and I will see you all on the next episode.